Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, and welcome to this week's Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. I'm very pleased to be joined by Shealeigh Voitl, who is with Project Censored. She is the digital and print editor and the co-editor of, and this is where I get to wave around this book. I have a copy of State of the Free Press 2025, Project Censored State of the Free Press 2025. And this is an annual book that Project Censored works on. Pleased to have you on the show. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much for having me, Kevin.
And so before we get into the issues that matter as we assess the media landscape, and just to be clear, Project Censored is about promoting critical media literacy, which, for those who do not know of the term, it basically means that there are ways in which you can better people's ability to understand the news media and the different pieces of online, print, or broadcast news that are coming out on a regular basis. But there's also, in our fractured landscape, a lot other different areas that are integral to understanding media nowadays. With that out of the way, you worked on this project. Why don't you tell people a little bit about how you were involved in working on this? Why you're proud today to be talking about the editing that you did on State of the Free Press 2025?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm especially proud because I was once a student writing the validated independent news stories, which is how we compile our top 25 stories. Every year of underreported news, we are able to collect validated independent news stories from students across the country. This year was our 49th cohort of students. But I was once a student at North Central College under Steve Masick. He was my professor in a media criticism class. And I found the assignment so illuminating. It transformed the way that I see news. So it feels very full circle to have been working with the project now for so long and to be a co-editor of this volume. I'm very grateful for the opportunity. And again, I worked on the Deja Vu news chapter for 2 volumes after I had graduated from college. And in this year's volume, it's no different how I feel about the chapter. I'm immensely proud of the work that the students and Steve Masick did this year, looking back at past top 25 stories and ways that the corporate media has failed to report meaningfully and update readers meaningfully on environmental stories, on stories of violence against women. This year specifically, there are stories about repression of Palestinian media. And so, it shows that these patterns of omission that we talk about a lot at the project. But I feel so proud of all of our contributors. It feels just really special, like I said, to have come full circle as a student and having that perspective, and then being a part of the process, vetting these stories and reading them and researching them, and watching all of the hard work that these students do to investigate issues that really interest them and energize them as journalism students, which was once me. So it feels especially cool this year.
That's really great. Yeah. No, I understand how uplifting it can be and just gratifying it can be to know that, everything that you've done so far has paid off, and now you're getting an opportunity to contribute to this book. And it opens, the way that it is framed is around this idea of reporting the truth to resist injustice. And we'll get into that. But I buried the lead just a little. Those of you who maybe don't know of Project Censored, it's possible that in the last years you have stumbled across their top 25 censored stories from the past year and a half or so. And that gets folded into, and that's what you were talking about with those verified news stories that students work on in a handful of colleges or universities throughout the United States. And so we're going to get into a few of those, but I've talked to Andy Lee Roth and Mickey Huff of Project Censored before, and I just want to be clear for people that the stories that I raise with you today, Shealeigh, they are not stories that you're necessarily an expert on. I just want, like, I always do that to lift the burden, because it's a thing that a lot of people from Project Censored who want to go on shows and discuss this, the host will just sit there and go through the censored stories like that person reported and worked on those stories and knows about them. But you're just talking about those stories and how they fit into the patterns of omission that you were describing, the way in which, whether it's MSNBC or New York Times, or let's say Fox News, or I don't know, even the array of podcasting shows that might be out there that are more popular that you follow, that they ignore these stories themselves without covering them. You were a student journalist. You were going through a program at a college where you were learning about the media, and there are students right now that are getting a crash course, or have in the last year received a crash course in journalism by going out and covering protests against Israel's war on Gaza. And so in effect, they have seen firsthand what it means to report the truth, to resist injustice, and where that fits into journalism. Before we get too far, why don't I let you back in here and speak about what we've seen with student journalists doing this reporting, feeling that they did have a responsibility on their college or university campus to cover what was happening, and how that war affected people here at home.
We talk about this in the book. Specifically, Andy and Mickey mention it in their introduction. Since October of last year, the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker used the tag Israel-Gaza war to document the many press freedom violations involving reporters covering reactions across the United States. So that includes protests on college campuses, public streets, city halls, from California and Washington to Texas, Illinois, New York. And so between October 2023 and May 2024, the tracker recorded 38 arrests of journalists, 37 assaults on journalists, 11 instances of equipment damage, and 3 chilling statements. And all of these were connected to the coverage of the ongoing genocide in Gaza. And I want to be clear too, these numbers don't even account for the journalists who were temporarily detained but not formally charged. So in other words, they were, taken away from the news until the story was over. So these are serious challenges that journalists are facing today, all over the world. And obviously, it has a chilling effect on news coverage and contributes to incomplete reporting on Israel's attack on Gaza, such as civilian casualties, the destruction of Gaza, the experiences of the affected communities. And also, obviously, too, the reactions of the public to, what's happening in Gaza, as we saw on college campuses, as you said. So yeah, this is, just one of the many serious challenges that journalists are facing today, all over the world, and is, the most straightforward form of press censorship.
And also related to this, you see that there's a lot of pressure. There are organizations like the Anti-Defamation League that go out of their way to set the boundaries for what kind of reporting or coverage is allowed in our media spaces. And so then what that translates to is an inverse problem, which is basically that you can get away with shoddy, false, or just awful reporting about what the resistance or the Hamas militants are doing. You can see factual inaccuracies printed about the October 7th attack. You can see people misrepresent the extent to which, I guess, Hamas is fighting back against Israel. You get a skewed portrayal, and then you also see that in the coverage, we aren't getting a complete picture all the time of the way that the United States is supporting Israel or what the Israeli military is doing. I don't know if there's anything you want to add about that, but that's certainly a dimension of what's covered in the opening of this book.
Yeah, I mean, it's critically important for journalists to speak on what's happening in Gaza, and it's critically important for journalists to be able to speak about what's happening in Gaza. In her news abuse chapter this year, Robin Anderson, talks about how strikingly biased corporate coverage has been since October 7th of last year, often presenting a pro-Israeli frame. And so, for example, Robin talks about a study by Adam Johnson and Othman Ali of The Intercept, where they analyzed 1,100 articles from the New York Times, Washington Post, and Los Angeles Times, and from the first 6 weeks of the assault on Gaza. And they found that the newspapers disproportionately emphasized Israeli deaths, which were reported 16 times more frequently than those of Palestinians. And the language that was used was, very different, distinctly different to describe casualties, where Israeli victims were slaughtered and massacred by Hamas, and Palestinians died. And reporters infrequently identified the Israeli military as responsible. So, these patterns of reporting shape people's understanding of what's happening in Gaza, and that has, serious rippling effects. So not only do we need journalists and media outlets to take seriously their duty to the public, but we also need to ensure that journalists and newsrooms' press freedoms aren't being violated, as we saw in May of last year, where the Israeli cabinet voted to ban Al Jazeera from operating in Israel, where they had been providing 24/7 live coverage of Israel's assault on Gaza.
Now, something that Project Censored articulates and tries to challenge is this idea of conventional journalistic objectivity. And the difference between conventional journalistic objectivity and then what you were getting into in your answer there, which is viewpoint transparency. So the idea could be that you would let other people know exactly why you're coming from a certain perspective or why you hold a certain perspective. Maybe you can get into a little bit more about that, and you can use Gaza or any other example that you would choose. But I will throw out there, just for context, that there was a UN report. I think it was a special rapporteur who worked on this report, and they were examining some of the impacts on press freedom, or freedom of expression as it's more broadly referred to in the world, and included a note that the Los Angeles Times had imposed this restriction on people who had put their names to, I think it was a kind of petition letter, an open letter against what was unfolding with the war. And this happened in the weeks after October 7th. And immediately the editors, the editorial staff there came down, or the management came down on these journalists and said, because you spoke up and made your position known. Actually, they were opposed to the carnage that was occurring, where there was a record number of journalist deaths already in the first month. And because they stood up for their colleagues, because they showed solidarity, they were told that they couldn't report on this topic for 6 to 8 months, something like that. And that is because they were bringing in their viewpoints to what they do as professionals, as media professionals. So maybe get into this idea of viewpoint transparency versus conventional journalistic objectivity.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that a journalist can be fully objective. I think Project Censored is on the record saying that that's kind of a myth. It's something that these media outlets champion, but we all are built with our own background and values and interests, and that is what makes us effective journalists, in my opinion. That is what drives us to report on issues that not only interest us, but we know are affecting marginalized communities. And in many cases, I mean, it's represented all throughout the top 25 list, are stories about marginalized issues and communities that are being neglected by the corporate media. And in many cases, this is, the work of intrepid journalists that are going in places that, media outlets that we see, New York Times, Washington Post, are not going. That idea that, we are completely objective, it's not always the case, and it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing. And Eleanor Goldfield actually just did a dispatch for us recently, talking about that very idea, and how important it is to remember that and keep that in your back pocket as a journalist.
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot to be said about how impossible it is to achieve an objectivity. And I think I've said here before on this show, so listeners might feel like this is familiar, but uh, choosing to be objective is, or choosing to be neutral is kind of a subjective decision on its own. Because what objectivity means in our media landscape is that you will be balanced. So it often means that you will take two sides and hold them up and say that these are equals. And so in doing that, there better be evidence or enough to persuade everyone that there is some kind of equality between those two things. But when there's not, and this is kind of provocative in our media spaces, but when it's all clear that the Israeli government is far, far, far more powerful and domineering than Hamas, for that matter, then it's really difficult to say that like these are the two sides. And you see so many issues where you'll take one thing, put it against each other. It'll happen a lot too, the way that we talk about, you might be familiar with this and how US politics gets talked about. There'll be some extreme act that happens on the part of some Republican group or whatever, and then it'll get equated to some left-wing thing. Like that's the exact same. Or I remember one of the things that was eye-rolling was the equality of like saying, well, the Democrats is Trump is actually Bernie Sanders. It's like, well, no, not really. Like we are totally dumbing down people by making those general comparisons.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think everybody is harmed from the both sidesing of media. Yeah, those false parallels do nothing for us. And I think, critical media literacy does teach us to, challenge those ideas and ask questions when we're presented with those false parallels. You mentioned obviously Gaza. We as the public, deserve to know the full scope of what's happening in Gaza, and should be able to trust in journalists and media organizations to report truthfully, fairly, also particularly when, American tax dollars are used to fund unspeakable violence against Palestinian people.
All right, so let's move into something that's a little bit more lighter, but also important. You have a section in the book that was put together, or you worked on this as the editor, that involves patriarchal junk food news, and just sort of using Taylor Swift as a figure that we can follow and understand many of the flaws in our media in the way that they approach issues involving misogyny or sexism or just women's issues in general. And I'll recall that in the last 2 or 3 weeks, it seemed just like suddenly, leaving aside Democratic Party politics, because I don't think they really are necessary to this conversation. In the last 2 or 3 weeks before Election Day, it was like, oh, wow, people really are angry that the Supreme Court took away their right to choose. This really could be the single issue that drives people to go vote a certain way at the polls. And, with that, I just thought, you guys aren't really, there are people working at these media organizations that just aren't contemplating certain things that are, integral to the survival of people, like necessary to the survival of people on a daily basis. And I think of that when I look at this chapter and see, some of the reactions to Taylor Swift are just plain silly, but then some of it gets to how we see a very degraded, very degraded coverage of women's issues.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a lot to unpack when it came to Taylor Swift this year. She was in the news a lot, between the Eras tour and, Travis Kelce. There was a lot to pay attention to, or at least, a lot that the establishment press wanted us to pay attention to. But the corporate media, does a great job at covering, pop culture and pop culture icons like Taylor Swift, but not as good of a job at covering the social structures they embody and symbolize. And I think this chapter really challenges readers to consider what stories are gaining traction and how they enforce consumerism. Additionally, how these establishment outlets are balancing coverage of, Taylor's record-breaking achievements with, pressing underreported stories, such as environmental issues or labor issues. So it poses these questions, while reflecting on how our attention has been misdirected in some ways.
Right. And also she gets set up as an avatar for discussing some of the, for lack of a better word, liberal issues. The media looks at her and says, oh, well, you want to be a do-gooder, but you're flying a private jet around, and that makes you a serious polluter, and it's hard to take seriously anything that you might do, let's say if her tour is trying to be sustainable or cares about the climate at all and its environmental impact. Well, but what are you doing with all of your private jets? And then in talking about this, you expose that while she's far from the top polluter, she's probably not even in the top 50% of polluters or top 75% of polluters in the world. No single rich person, though we could, have our own opinions about flying around in private jets if we wanted to. But I think that's just playing to, this idea that we should reject those who obtain this elite status in our popular culture. And it's just another way of dividing us. It's another way of the media can point to Taylor Swift and make us resent that somebody has a lot of money that they can spend freely. While in the meantime, we have rampant income inequality, and the rich get richer, and the bottom 99% just continue to see their wealth shrink. And so, who are we to take our outrage out on? Taylor Swift, because she's making music and reaping billions of dollars in profit.
Yeah, I mean, it was, it was clear as day, like what was happening, I think between people's outrage of her, at the NFL games constantly, it was just like kind of a pile on. But we talk about, her Eras tour, definitely definitely, between the Eras tour and the flights to NFL games, it dumped tons of CO2 into the Earth's atmosphere. But, she's not the only one. There are many other billionaires polluting, but also, in the junk food chapter talks about this as well. The DoD remains the most carbon intensive polluting institution in the world. So again, that's just like one example, of our attention sort of being misdirected. These things can be factually accurate, but still really misleading.
And just to clarify, we're not really talking about Taylor Swift. We're talking about the media coverage and their fixation on Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift is not an important issue. It's only important if you just want to read tabloid news magazines and see what she's doing on a daily basis. You can follow her on Instagram, and that's fine. But what is important about this chapter, and it's one that's regularly in the annual book, is looking at the junk food news, looking at the theme or the thread for something that was just an absolute fixation of the media. They said, we're just going to keep on pounding this and try to get clicks and eyeballs and people to care about this. And then it pushes these stories out of the way that we're going to get to here. So as we wrap and wind down this conversation, there's a top 25 censored stories. And I think naturally the next one that we should just highlight and mention that is in this is that activists are rallying to denounce fossil fuel investments, and that you see something happening to deal with the pollution, not Taylor Swift's pollution, but dealing with the fossil fuel industry, which is the not more than the U.S. military, but is a huge purveyor, but also responsible for the disinformation and misinformation that we read about climate science.
Yeah. So our number 16 story this year covered environmental activists who organized to protest insurance company support of the fossil fuel industry from late February to early March of 2024. And that was according to reports by Common Dreams and Inside Climate News. And the movement was established by Inside Our Future, an organization devoted to promoting a transition to clean energy and holding insurance companies, corporations, accountable for their continued support of fossil fuel projects. And so the biggest of these protests took place in New York City at the headquarters of three major insurance companies, Chubb, Tokyo Marine, and AIG. And this came after a report by Insure Our Future, Rainforest Action Network, and Public Citizen that found at least 35 insurers were underwriting controversial liquefied natural gas export infrastructure along the U.S. Gulf Coast. And Insure Our Future also reported that 12 California insurance companies that have announced coverage restrictions in the state made an estimated $3.6 billion by insuring fossil fuel infrastructure. And the Wall Street Journal covered sort of, the pressure these companies were receiving from regulators, legislators, and activists. However, most corporate outlets were failing to cover sort of the damaging and long-term impact to our planet, of these fossil fuel insurance policies.
Yeah, I imagine that the Wall Street Journal's coverage is more like, here's a nuisance that these businesses have to deal with. There's some regulators that want them to take these actions or be concerned about this. And, obviously, why should they have to worry about it? They need to be making their money. So another issue, and this is something that is traditionally a big part of the group of censored stories that get covered annually. I always find that there's something horrible about our environment that you can find in the list that we should all know about and take seriously. Droughts, forest fires, something of that magnitude. You have a story that caught my attention. I just wanted to highlight because I'm actually learning about this from looking at the top 25 censored stories. And I consume quite a lot of news media coverage of stories. So this is about saltwater intrusion into the U.S. fresh water supplies. Again, you're not an expert on this, but the idea that our media isn't covering this significant problem for people and, maybe even treating it as a local issue. It comes out of Louisiana, and it's probably covered in the sense of, it's just something that the people of the southern U.S. will have to deal with without appreciating the way it could expand.
Yeah, no, so I appreciate you saying that, this was something that you were learning about for the first time. It was my experience as well. This was our number 3 story this year, and it was based on a pair of articles from The Guardian and The Conversation. And as you said, it covered saltwater intrusion from the Gulf of Mexico up the Mississippi River, infiltrating freshwater systems of the Delta region and contaminating drinking and agricultural water supplies, as well as inland ecosystems. And, this is one of the many results of climate change. In coastal regions across the US and globally, sea levels are drastically rising. Delaney Nolan's article for The Guardian explains how along, every coast runs a salt line where fresh inland water meets seawater. And when weather events like floods and storms occur, it pushes it further out. But the rising sea levels are gradually drawing the salt line in. And when the Gulf Coast and Midwest regions, experienced severe drought in 2023, it drew the salt line even further. And so, seawater intrusion is happening, all over the world. Most threatened places are communities on low-lying islands, such as the Marshall Islands. And there are many consequences that come along with this, which, Holly Michael discusses in her article for The Conversation. Drinking water that contains even 2% of seawater 2% seawater can increase blood pressure and stress kidneys. Salt water can corrode pipes and produce toxic disinfection byproducts in water treatment plants. And it can have serious impacts on infrastructure, reducing, the lifespan of roads and bridges. And, as you said, like some major corporate outlets like CNN, Time, and CBS covered saltwater intrusion in fall of last year, but focused primarily on the threat to coastal Louisiana. And so they treat this issue largely as a localized issue and a short-term problem, when in fact, it's a very widespread and escalating consequence of the climate crisis.
Right. These water crises that pop up, it's usually, okay, the governor, the mayor got his pallets of bottled water out and gave them to the community, and they're responding, they're taking care of it, and then we just move on to the next story. So this is why Project Censored's work is important in documenting how these issues don't go away, and all of this is right in front of us. It's our responsibility to deal with it. So finally, this is not by any means the most critical issue, but the organization's name is Project Censored. So I figured a way to end this discussion should be to note that one of the most popular ways of listening to music for everyone, Spotify, has been engaged in the blatant censorship of artists that are pro-Palestinian. But not just because Spotify chooses to do it, but because there is an organization out there that has been pressuring Spotify to remove particular artists.
Yeah, this was our number 25 story this year. It was a report done by Alan McLeod for Mint Press. And, it found that this organization called We Believe in Israel, which was a subsidiary of Britain-Israel Communications and Research Center, had been attempting to censor Palestinian and pro-Palestinian music artists from Spotify. The group had also been lobbying the streaming service as well as the UK government. And the organization sort of set out to remove Arabic music it believed was harmful to the state of Israel or contained lyrics that were critical of Israel. And early last year, Spotify did just that, removing, several Arabic songs from the platform. And one artist that was targeted by the group was British Iraqi artist Loki for his pro-Palestinian activism. And We Believe in Israel claimed Loki's music was direct incitement of violence toward Jews and Israelis. But there was immediate backlash, thousands signing a counter petition in defense of Loki and his art, thankfully. And, it's obviously outrageous that as of now, there has been no corporate coverage of this by U.S. corporate media. But it's, unsurprising, I think, considering the disappointing coverage of other coverage related to Palestinian liberation.
By and large, it's been my experience that censorship of Palestinian voices usually doesn't make it into the conversation. We can hear about so-called conservative voices being removed, or, if you want to put it this way, policed because of the way in which they choose to talk about marginalized communities, usually in a derogatory or hate-filled manner. That becomes an uproar. You can see a policing of the spread of misinformation and disinformation. That can be a kind of censorship that makes it into media coverage. But as far as Palestinians go, they're usually completely erased from any of this conversation. And there's an artist who is pro-Palestinian and has not hidden his solidarity with people in Gaza, David Rovics, and he's had his album Notes on a Holocaust basically taken down from Spotify. It's grayed out. Like, it's not something you can play anymore. So it looks like the copyright lapsed, and you'd usually think that was an artist's decision, and Spotify is showing that the artist is the problem and they need to renew their license with Spotify for streaming. But in fact, there's nothing wrong with it. Spotify is just not letting people access that music anymore. So you're welcome to add anything if you want to about your experience, but it does seem like Palestinians or Arabs, as to the extent that they experience censorship in our U.S. media or Western media in general, since you're talking about a story that happened in the UK, we just don't see that become a controversy.
Yeah, no, it's shameful. It's completely shameful. And once again, I mean, I think just like you and I, at least for me, I shouldn't speak for you, but when I saw this on the list, it was something that I had not heard about at all. So I'm glad at least that it made it on the list, but so other people can learn and be looking for that kind of stuff now too. But yeah, I mean, it's shameful to see those voices suppressed, and for that to mostly be flying under everyone's radar.
I'm just a little strange here. So I interviewed Loki before, and I'm familiar with the censorship that he had experienced. But for the fact that I've spoken to him or had a chance to follow what was going on, as I vaguely remember, I wouldn't have any idea that Spotify was doing this. And actually, you said that Arabic artists had been removed. I didn't really know that, although I could have presumed that wholesale they would have been going through those particular musicians. I mean, there are a few artists that I like to listen to, and I'm pleased to say that they're still there. And then I suppose in this environment, I'm hesitant to name them because I wouldn't want somebody to go, oh, we missed those musicians. Let's go back and take them off of Spotify. But with that being said, it's been really good to talk with you. Is there anything else about State of the Free Press 2025 that you want to share or tell everyone? And then if there isn't anything that we have missed, please let people know where they can get a copy of this if they'd like to dig into these issues related to the U.S. media landscape.
This book is obviously filled with clusters of stories about, environmental issues, labor issues, big tech issues that are, obviously kind of doom and gloom. We've talked about those, but it's also, filled with hope for the future, solutions journalism, particularly in the Media Democracy in Action chapter, and even in some stories featured on the top 25 list. So that, there is a way forward. We do have power, and I think, seeing that represented in the book is every year gives me some perspective when looking through, some of these stories. But yeah, visit projectcensored.org for access to State of the Free Press 2025 to get your own copy. I couldn't recommend it more. I learn so much every year working on this book. It's truly like the joy of my professional career to be able to learn so much from independent journalists. And I hope everyone feels the same.
Thank you. And I should add that this show, Unauthorized Disclosure, was featured in the Media Democracy in Action chapter several years ago. And that's something that we don't usually talk about because I suppose if I'm being honest, it's a good story. It's like a good news story. And we just like to talk about bad stuff. But no, like it highlights and has over the book's life, over the time that State of the Free Press has been published, been a space for highlighting those people out there that are really struggling to create independent journalism and challenge corporate media structures and force out there the stories that we really need to be reading and consuming. And so, anyways, I thank you for your work on this as an editor, and I look forward to how you might work and contribute to future Project Censored books. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Kevin. Thanks for having me.